hosted by the Canadian Donation Transplant Research Program. The CDTRP is hosted by the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. At this time, I'd also like to acknowledge that our participants are joining from across Turtle Island, also now known as Canada, which includes the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. All people living in Canada are treaty people. We are all a part of a relationship based on the recognition of respect, cooperation, partnership, and Indigenous rights. I would like you to take an opportunity to share where you're calling in from today and to acknowledge the territory that you work and play in. At this time, I'd also like to indicate that this session is being recorded. If you do not wish to be on camera when it comes to your turn to speak, you can turn your camera off. Thank you. I'd also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the Canadian Institute of Health Research, known as CIHR. This series was made possible due to their financial support. I would now like to invite Dr. Dimitri Rosenberg and Lisa Wickerson to share a little bit more about the objectives of this webinar series and for their presentation entitled Rehabilitation After Solid Organ Transplantation, the Canadian Landscape. And I just get a little bit of a bio on both of them, please. Dr. Dimitri Rosenberg is a respirologist at the University Health Network in Toronto and an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. He began his studies in kinesiology and health science at York University, which sparked his passion for physical fitness and exercise training. Dr. Rosenberg's research aims to understand the impact of physical fitness and skeletal muscle function on daily physical function, quality of life, frailty, healthcare use, and survival before and after lung transplantation, and also solid organ transplantation. Dr. Lisa Wickerson is an assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto and an affiliate scientist at the University Health Network's Toronto General Hospital Research Institute and the Ajamura Transplant Center. Her clinical experience is in rehabilitation before and after lung transplant. Her current research examines hybrid models of pulmonary rehabilitation and remote patient monitoring. I now pass the stage over to you, Dr. Rosenberg, Dimitri, and Dr. Lisa Wickerson, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm just going to start by sharing my slides. And maybe if someone can just indicate that that's showing up appropriately.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes, so Dimitri and I have the privilege of starting this first webinar series, the first presentation, and we are going to be speaking about rehabilitation after solid organ transplant and really this Canadian landscape. And because we're both working out of Toronto or Takaranto, we just wanted to offer our brief land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So as Sandra said, I just want to start with a few of the objectives in terms of the introduction and overview of this grant and these proposed activities that we're doing within this webinar series. And then Dimitri and I are going to co-present a presentation talking about rehabilitation after solid organ transplant. So reviewing some of the effects of exercise training, discuss the current exercise recommendations, and then talk about 2 surveys that we've done. in terms of looking at the availability and characteristics of solid organ transplant rehabilitation across Canada, and then look at some of the future directions of solid organ transplant rehab. As we're probably all aware, there are challenges to our healthcare system and resources, and what sort of creative ways and that we can be thinking in terms of delivery to ensure that people have access to rehabilitation. So just to start out, we were fortunate to get a CIHR Planning and Dissemination grant for a project that was titled Building and Maintaining Functional Resilience Through Physical Activity and Exercise After Solid Organ Transplant. And we have our co-Is here, Sherry, Ashley, and Sandra. And then we have a number of collaborators, including the CDTRP and numerous collaborators across the country that we've been fortunate to work with over the years. And so our objectives for this project and our activities were to host a platform for meaningful discussions and knowledge exchange and collaborations, really aiming at developing and continuing to develop a comprehensive understanding of physical activity, exercise, and resilience in solid organ transplant recipients. And so you would have received the series and the dates of upcoming talks that we have in this series. And the main aim is that we want to establish this diverse and really multidisciplinary group of individuals. So people with lived experience, clinicians, researchers, and other stakeholders, just to continue to promote and advance this field of physical activity and exercise after solid organ transplant. We really wanted to have this focus on active living, independence, productivity, and social engagement. And then to leverage existing resources. So again, to continue to improve long-term outcomes related to physical activity and exercise, and really focusing on community-based centers to support this training for life approach, which we can talk a little bit more about in the discussion. And then to develop and disseminate accessible education materials. So again, our goal is that every person undergoing solid organ transplant in Canada can receive this supportive material after transplant at hospital discharge. So again, today we have Dimitri and I, and then we're going to hear from Ashley from her experiences with rehabilitation post-transplant. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of an interactive activity. So if you have your phone and you can scan this QR code that's at the bottom there, we just have 2 questions. And maybe, Amal, can you just let me know how best to share? Should I stop sharing and you can pull up the response?
Yes, I can pull up the responses.
Okay, so I'll just stop sharing then?
Yes.
Okay. So we were looking just for maybe 1 or 2 words for each of the questions. So the first question we have was, what is the main benefit of rehabilitation after transplantation? We'll just give people a minute there. Can Great. So I see a lot of things coming up around recovery, speed of recovery, quality of life, which is obviously so important. Just that functioning strength, that independence, which I think, yeah, are all very important in that concept of stamina and resilience. So that's great. I think we've targeted our webinar series on the right things. And then we have one other question, and again, just thinking of a couple word answer. What is a key limitation to accessing rehabilitation? So I'll let maybe Amal put up the next option. Yeah, so great. So I think we're seeing some barriers that I think we all can deal with, I think, in terms of, time and maybe location, some finances, and then maybe some very specific transplant related barriers potentially in terms of maybe some health issues or follow up with clinic and medical appointments, for example, and then that availability of rehab centers, which is definitely one that is a limitation. So I think that we will be talking about these things in our talk and our discussion. So that's great. Thank you very much for participating. And I'll reshare my slides if that's all right. Just want to make sure I'm right here. All right. Good. Okay. So I'm going to continue on. So I made this sort of timeline, and this is sort of a general timeline over the last sort of 15, 16 years in terms of understanding rehab and solid organ transplant in Canada. So there's obviously a lot of different people that do work in this area, but these are key events or things that happened with that, I've been involved in, and a lot of my collaborators and different Canadian committees have been involved in. And so I wanted just to start back in 2010 because I did a survey with the University of Toronto looking at solid organ transplant in Canada, because I'd worked for a number of years at Toronto General Hospital doing rehabilitation and lung transplant, and really wanting to get an understanding of what's going on across the country. And so I'll be talking about that study coming up in a couple slides. And then around the same time, a group of researchers and clinicians got a CHR planning grant to really talk about research priorities in solid organ transplant. And then in 2013, around the same time, CDTRP, which was actually CNTRP at that time, was formed, and they had these themes. And again, theme 5, as Sandra said, was restoring long-term health. And Can Restore, which was a network that really is invested in increasing knowledge and resources around exercise and physical activity after transplant, was formed. We had the Exercise Hub as part of the CDTRP. And then this Can Restore and the Canadian Society of Transplant got together and looked at the evidence and really put together guidelines for exercise after solid organ transplant. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, a lot of delivery of rehab and accessibility and availability changed. And so we were fortunate to get another planning and dissemination grant to really look at telerehabilitation, or offering a rehabilitation at a distance or digitally, and looking at the state of that after solid organ transplant. And then about a year ago, Dimitri and I did another survey to get an update on what's changed in rehabilitation and solid organ transplant across Canada. And then again, this current planning grant to look at that focus on long-term functional resilience. So just briefly talking about that first study. So we did a study in 2010, and we surveyed, there's 58 programs that we accessed through the Canadian Association of Transplant. And at that time, we only really heard from sort of heart and lung transplant programs that had rehabilitation programs. We identified one liver transplant program that had rehab, but at that time there was no kidney programs that responded to our survey to said that they offered rehabilitation. And again, this is 2010, so most of these rehab programs were delivered in person. There wasn't telerehabilitation significantly at that time. And we really wanted to look at some of the barriers. And again, some of what was talked about in our Menti response, funding, a shortage of programs, healthcare personnel, also, a low volume of patients in a centralized area where there'd be a rehabilitation program. And then the last one was this insufficient standardized rehab protocol, or maybe knowledge about exercise and what is best. So certainly that last one is something that was a real focus in terms of how we could improve in that area. And this is just the response from the kidney transplant programs, because again, we didn't identify any programs either pre or post transplant at that time. And you can see that, the main limitations, again, is a lot of that volume of patients in a centralized area, funding and healthcare personnel, less concerns about, cost outweighing the benefits or people being too ill to exercise. And these are just the perceived need and feasibility. So again, the responses really didn't match with, what was happening, is they felt that there was a need for rehab and it potentially could be feasible, and that there were some appropriate rehab centers close by that they could refer people to. So what we did is we had this meeting report it got funded for to look at looking at a research agenda in exercise and solid organ transplant. And this was a 2-day person meeting in Toronto in 2013. And we had over 60 participants, a variety of stakeholders. And what the objectives there were to increase communication and collaboration across different types of solid organ transplant and look at areas of commonality and uniqueness that we could focus, research and knowledge translation on, and really looking at high leverage questions around exercise after solid organ transplant. And so this was published, this is just a table, but what really came out here was that knowledge translation was a top priority. So really wanting to think about how we could disseminate current evidence and identify gaps in evidence to these relative stakeholders so that we could work at sort of bridging some of these gaps. And I mentioned earlier, Can Restore, which is this Canadian network, was also founded, and their mission is to achieve optimal health and well-being for transplant candidates and recipients through physical activity and rehabilitation. And so what they really want to do is there's that dissemination of evidence-based knowledge. They also want to build healthcare capacity in terms of training, providing resources and support, and empowering healthcare professionals that work in rehabilitation, and then empowering patients and families through education, advocacy, and community engagement. So certainly physical activity is important. It's important for everyone. It is one of the pillars of self-care. And while there's a big variety, there are people that are very active after transplant. On the whole, people after transplant do tend to be more sedentary than the general population. And if we look at the guidelines from the World Health Organization, and this is for adults with chronic conditions, they recommend, in terms of moderate intensity activity, about 150 to 300 minutes per week, or vigorous activity of 75 to 150 minutes, and muscle strengthening at least 2 times a week. And we know that physical activity and physical fitness are predictive of post-transplant outcomes and survival. So this was a study, this was a systematic review and meta-analysis of the randomized control trials that looked at exercise versus no training in adult solid organ transplant recipients. And I'm just showing on this table some of the primary outcomes, which were exercise capacity, or VO2 peak, quadricep or muscle, leg muscle strength, and then health-related quality of life, which are all very important measures. And these measures all showed improvement. With the health-related quality of life, this was measured using the SF-36 questionnaire. Not all domains increased, but the domains that increased were physical functioning, physical role functioning, general health, social role functioning, and mental health. This study also reported some secondary outcomes, which were cardiovascular risk factors. They did find that diastolic blood pressure improved, but the other metrics that they were looking at did not show any significant change. But it was indicated that a lot of studies don't necessarily test or evaluate this when they're looking at exercise training. The other thing that was reported in this study is that there was a significant variation in terms of exercise training. So sometimes that's a challenge in terms of combining the statistics and comparing the results. So as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Society of Transplant and Can Restore did get together and develop recommendations for exercise. So they looked at both a pediatric and adult, and they looked at pre-transplant and post-transplant. I'm just going to focus on adult post-transplant for this presentation. And again, they looked at research of any study design, and we also looked at expert opinion where there was gaps in evidence. And it was reported that exercise training was safe, should consist of both aerobic and resistance training. And again, aligning to that World Health Organization guidelines, it should be a moderate to vigorous intensity level, 3 to 5 times a week for a minimum of 8 weeks. And we divided it into sort of early and late post-transplant periods. So again, early, or if there's periods of medical instability, it's recommended that exercise is supervised either in an outpatient setting or home. And then late post-transplant, can be unsupervised, be in a home or a fitness center, for example. Again, this evidence, as indicated in the slide before, was fairly high quality for the post-transplant group in terms of exercise capacity, leg strength, and health-related quality of life, but really wanting to also continue to look at those emerging outcomes in terms of metabolic and cardiovascular risk, frailty, and bone health, for example. And then this is the last slide before I move it over to Dimitri. So we looked at, with the thought that there are some limitations in healthcare resources and the capacity of rehabilitation programs. There's the thought of how can digital health and digital apps support people's exercise and physical activity. And so we did this qualitative research study a few years ago, and it involved 21 people after a variety of different solid organ transplant surgeries. People were between 1.5 to 16 years post-transplant. And I'm just listing here the main themes of the interviews that we did. And so the participants thought that yes, digital health apps could be very useful, potential good strategy, but they wanted with these apps that there is really specific physical activity guidance, not general guidelines, but really specific. What exercises are safe to do? What exercises are safe for my type of transplant? At what times post-transplant? And I think there's this awareness of that. Any app should account for people that might not have, a consistent well health, like people that are participating or experiencing nonlinear health trajectories. That has to be aligned with goal setting and reward systems within the app. So if there's changes or disruptions to health or even physical activity routines because of having to attend clinic or medical appointments, that should be incorporated. Certainly the affordability of technology, which we also heard in our Menti response. And then thinking about integration and design, people reported that they had multiple apps for different things, and they really would like one that could integrate a lot of features so that they could manage several aspects of their health simultaneously on one app. And then again, wanting transplant-specific features. So some people perhaps are wanting, a pulse oximetry if they perhaps have had a lung transplant. They really want to watch their oxygen levels. Maybe heart rate monitoring is more important for some people after heart transplant, for example, or diet or hydration may be more important for people after kidney transplant. So wanting something that's very specific. And then the last point was really the selective sharing with healthcare providers. These apps can collect a lot of information. Do you want to necessarily have all that information going to your healthcare professionals, or do you want to be selective with it? There is some hesitancy that, what decisions are going to be made based on some of this information, and having some agency over what to share and what not to share. So now, Dimitri, I'm going to advance the slides for you, and you're up.
Thank you, Lisa, for presenting, and thanks for CDRP and CIHR for helping us bring this talk. So I'll take over and present on the landscape as what it looked like in 2023 and onwards. So in the last few years, building on Lisa's timeline, Tanya, who's a medical student at U of T with the CDRP group, we decided to evaluate online resources as a source of information for exercise and physical activity in solid organ transplant recipients, and we really wanted to see what was publicly available. And so we used instruments that are well known in the internet space, so Discern, Global Quality Scale, and patient education materials. And we evaluated the content and quality of online English resources. And we had observed that there were 49 websites and 34 videos on Google and YouTube that had addressed the topic of physical activity or exercise. what was interesting when we looked at those Canadian Society of Transplant recommendations that Lisa presented earlier in terms of what was ideal for an exercise program, they only partly captured some of these elements, as you could see in these histograms to the right, around that 60 to 80% of the websites. And certainly there were a couple of key elements that were missing from the websites or YouTube videos that are certainly important for maintenance of physical activity, such as goal setting, equipment needs, discussions on a certain environmental considerations, etc. So what we found was the overall quality when we used the global quality scale discern was moderate at best. And there was a high reading level, almost grade 10 or 11, where online resources should be around that grade 6 or 7 level. And so the recommendations was needed a targeted strategies that consider comprehensive content and actionability in developing exercise and physical activity resources for solid organ transplant recipients. And certainly the field's advancing in this area with artificial intelligence being able to evaluate resources much quicker and perhaps tailoring these resources in the future. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, there are a number of rehabilitation delivery considerations that have emerged since the COVID pandemic in 2020. And these are just examples. Obviously, there are hybrid programs where you have in-person exercise, but certainly you can have synchronous, so monitoring of exercises in the home environment by an exercise professional, or you can have group sessions as shown in the right figure. And then there's also apps that are available in an asynchronous fashion and on multiple online resources you heard. Next, please. So given the variability of various rehabilitation approaches post-pandemic, we received funding from CIHR and part of the Exercise Hub through CDRP. We undertook a 2-day virtual meeting, which was held in February of 2023 and brought together over 30 Canadian adult and pediatric researchers, clinician, patient, and family partners. And the main objectives of the meeting were to facilitate knowledge exchange and dialogue and telerehabilitation between patient partners, healthcare professionals, researchers, and key stakeholders, and identify gaps in clinical practice and research in telerehabilitation. It really focused on delivery methods, digital tools, and facilitators and barriers, and the effects of TR, especially on physical and mental health, which you'll hear shortly as well. Next slide, please. And so from the meeting, which is available in terms of the summary and frontiers, rehab, 4 key elements emerged. There were delivery methods, and we heard that hybrid or virtual, and there was quite a bit of variability across sites and centers, and multiple online educational resources. Also, the barriers and facilitators that were echoed, and we followed up with the survey subsequently. But some of the barriers to telerehabilitation that were mentioned were familiarity with technology, levels of engagement, environmental equipment and home environment, and then also digital tools and applications. So the proficiency of the individual and the caregiver being able to utilize the digital tools, but also the institutional policies and educational resources available were important pieces as well to consider. And then we heard from our patient partners and others that mental health is a key consideration that needs to be incorporated into rehabilitation programs that is often overlooked or the resources may not be available. Next slide. And so these are some questions that were put together by the group for considerations for clinical and research. And as you can see, some of the key elements were safety and monitoring. So for instance, what information should be included in the safety guidelines or a home environment plan? Mental health, as I mentioned earlier, needs to be a consideration, and how do we advocate and promote that in the programs? What are the technological barriers and what equipment would be beneficial to deliver telerehabilitation effectively? And then the timing. When is the best timing for telerehabilitation? In the early, late post-transplant period, hybrid models, and then also the collaboration and knowledge translation piece across centers is so important, learning from each other. And then the motivation and engagement when we get into the later parts of post-transplant, how do we maintain that physical activity and exercise routine? Next slide, please. And so we undertook, this was led by Sahar, The group here, Lisa and I, in the CDRP, we undertook an electronic survey where we were interested in updating the 2010 survey of the Canadian solid organ transplant rehabilitation programs that have been identified through the Can Restore website. There were actually 20 that were listed, and we were able to identify 17 through correspondence, and 10 actually ended up participating. And really, the survey focused on exercise training and supervision practices, clinical outcome measures, delivery models, safety considerations, facilitators, and barriers, which I'll share on the subsequent slides. And so the main change that emerged, as you could see from the 2010 survey, the post-COVID, the majority of the solid organ transplant rehabilitation program, so 60%, use some form of hybrid approaches. So as you can see in this orange line, where 20 had in-person only, and then there was a mix of approaches. But certainly you could see from this slide where prior to the COVID pandemic, clinical practice was around 70%. And these were from these centers, from their recollection. Next slide. Also, when we asked the programs what were the main assessments that they undertook, these were the key outcomes and metrics that oftentimes programs would measure, and which were echoed actually throughout the last decade. So as you can see, exercise capacity across the solid organ transplant programs is a key element that's captured pretty homogeneously, both with initial and after completion of the rehabilitation program. In terms of muscular conditioning and endurance and strength, that was captured by about 50% of the programs. Frailty was also in about 50% of the program, more commonly in the initial phase, and body composition as well. And then quality of life and other patient-reported outcome measures were less frequently captured. Next slide. We looked at barriers and facilitators, but just kind of highlighting the barriers. They were very similar to the 2010 survey. But what's interesting is, once again, the top barriers were limited funding, despite the telerehabilitation or in-person programs, and also limited healthcare personnel. So even with the telerehabilitation approach, you do need that ability to supervise, even if it's asynchronous programs. And so these were the top two barriers that were highlighted that we could certainly discuss today. But just to highlight some of the other key barriers that were mentioned that were somewhat eliminated with telerehabilitation were space constraints. So obviously with the virtual environment, but patient safety concerns were raised, technological limitations, and then some of the other variables were more minor in nature. Next slide, please. And so other things that were echoed during the survey was many of these programs also had adjunctive services such as nutritional support, patient education, mental health support, and referral to other programs and healthcare providers such as geriatrics, physiatry, palliative care. Given the complexity of this patient population, certainly you need to consider this at various phases in the post-transplant period. And so it takes a multidisciplinary approach. Next slide. And so this survey provides a more recent update on what the landscape across Canada is for solid organ transplant rehabilitation programs. More importantly, it is in many of the transplant provinces, and there are a couple of centers, and we can discuss this subsequently, that don't have telerehabilitation or solid organ transplant programs specifically. And you can see the evolution in the last 15 years, but as highlighted, the barrier and constraints still remain in terms of funding and healthcare personnel. And hybrid certainly programs appears to be here to stay for the near future. But a number of opportunities for future clinical and research collaborations. Next slide. And so to summarize key takeaway messages from the presentation today, it's very important to consider self-care and management strategies for transplant recipients, especially in the longer term post-transplant period, including regular physical activity. There are multiple facilitators and barriers to physical activity. There are still limited rehabilitation centers in Canada that really focus on solid organ transplantation populations, but certainly there are other various rehabilitation programs that are available. And then digital health is a promising strategy to increase access. However, we need to consider equity, equality, and digital literacy as certainly very important. Next slide. And so we'll have a discussion now, but just as a reminder, our next session, you'll hear it, will be on April 29th. And as Lisa highlighted, really the focus today and the discussion will be on rehabilitation post-transplant, where we are in 2026 and how we got here, and what can we do over the next 5 to 10 years to move the needle forward. And then the next subsequent sessions will focus on sports participation post-transplant. We'll also have wearable devices and virtual exercise options, and focusing on the resilience and action tools to thrive. And certainly we want to hear from the audience today, what you'd like to hear over the next subsequent sessions as well, and where we want to go with this. Next slide. And so I'd open up the floor now for questions and discussion, and thanks once again for the opportunity to participate and present funding from CIHR and CDRP support. Thank you.
So thank you for a very productive discussion. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Ashley Loken. Ashley is a health sciences student at Western University and a liver transplant recipient. Growing up as a transplant recipient, she has shaped her understanding of the healthcare system from a personal perspective and inspired her interest in patient-oriented research. Her lived experience has guided her commitment to patient voice and research. She is actively involved in research and community initiatives focused on collaboration, education, and advocacy. Her presentation is entitled, What Physical Activity Means After Transplant. And before I ask Ashley to present, I'd just like to say what an honor it is to have you here. I've known Ashley since I met her at the Sick Kids 25th anniversary at the Toronto Zoo. I think it was in 2011. So she was under the age of 5. And to watch her to grow up and her family raise funds under Ashley's Angels, it's just so great. So I welcome you, Ashley, and look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. I'll be speaking about physical activity after transplant from a lived experience perspective. So one phrase that really shaped my understanding of life post-transplant was transplant is a treatment, not a cure. I had my transplant when I was 2, so I don't really remember life before. All I know is that I'd been given a second chance, and that second chance required lifelong management, including medications, appointments, and precautions. As a kid, much of my life revolved around attending medical care, and maintaining my health through physical activity was one of the aspects. But for me, physical activity wasn't just part of managing my health. It became something that brought me balance, normalcy, and confidence. As I grew up, it became really important to me that people didn't just see me as a transplant recipient. That was only one part of who I am. I'm also a health science student, an athlete, a friend, a daughter, a sister, and an aspiring doctor. Each of these roles has shaped me just as much as my transplant has. Physical activity played a major role in helping me both and others see myself as happy and healthy. Being an athlete allowed me to redefine what strength looked like in my own life. Every practice, every workout, and every competition reinforced that my body was capable. Sports helped me to shift the narrative from transplant patient to teammate, competitor, and leader. Studying health sciences and aspiring to become a doctor has also transformed how I view my experience. Instead of being defined by a medical event, I'm able to use it as motivation. My transplant didn't just affect my health, it inspired my purpose. It deepened my empathy and strengthened my commitment to caring for others. At the same time, I'm a daughter, a sister, and a friend. These relationships are a huge part of my life and have shaped the person that I am today. A transplant can change your life, but it doesn't have to define it. It's one part, a very important part, but it exists along passions, goals, relationships, and dreams. For me, embracing all these roles has been so meaningful. But that development didn't come without barriers. There were definitely setbacks and periods where I fell behind because I was recovering from procedures or other complications. I had to realize that the progress wasn't linear. There was also fear of pushing too hard, fear of jeopardizing the very gift that gave me a second chance. And as an athlete and a transplant recipient, I carried that awareness that my body had already been through so much. That awareness easily turned into hesitation. At times, I questioned whether I should compete at the same level as my peers. I worried about what would happen if something went wrong. Those mental barriers were often just as challenging as the physical ones. Then the pandemic added another layer of uncertainty that was magnified, especially for transplant recipients. There was heightened isolation, stricter precautions, and a constant awareness of risk. It reinforced a feeling that I had known before, that lack of control. Living with a transplant means living with uncertainty and becoming familiar with that idea that not everything is within your power. Comparison was another barrier. I often felt behind my peers, especially during periods when my health forced me to slow me down. Watching others move forward while I was recovering impacted my confidence. And it's really difficult not to compare yourself to others, even when your circumstances are different. I had to redefine what success meant to myself and understand that my timeline didn't have to match anyone else's. My parents' concern also shaped my experience. They were understandably protective, and their fears, though sometimes contrasted with my desire to push myself and compete fully. Navigating that dynamic required communication and trust and growth. Over time, we learned how to balance this caution with confidence. Despite these barriers, though, there was a lot of facilitators that made my success happen. Family support for me was crucial. My family was always my biggest cheerleaders, and practically speaking, they were able to drive me to practice and financially support so many opportunities that gave me the structural support that I needed. Having doctors that also supported me was so important. My doctor was so great at letting me know when the risks were real and when I didn't even have to consider my transplant as a risk factor. This allowed me to be where I am today and as healthy as I am. Additionally, I made so many friends in sports, and they brought a sense of belonging to a community and the normalcy that I needed growing up. Over time, enjoyment of sports became a facilitator on its own, and success builds motivation and confidence. Eventually, as I grew up, wanting to be physically active shifted from externally supported to internally driven. Digital tools add another layer of support. I used a smartwatch to track my physical activity and progress, which I found was really helpful. And during the pandemic, when I wasn't able to participate in sports, I found that online workout classes and programs were really great because they were so easy and accessible, especially during COVID. Now I use my phone to track my workouts and monitor progress. Exercise brings a sense of normal. It allows participation rather than restriction. It builds trust in your body. After transplant, there's always an awareness of vulnerability, but movement rebuilds that confidence. It builds autonomy. It's one piece of maintaining your health that you can control. Now I choose to work out every day to provide balance and keep my body strong and energized. It's a great opportunity to de-stress after a long day of studying. And additionally, staying physically active has its benefits to overcome medical obstacles should they arrive. For example, I have a biopsy in May. Knowing that I've prioritized my health through physical activities provides me with reassurance that my recovery will be faster and I can get back to living my best life quickly. In my experience, physical activity isn't just about rehabilitation, it's empowerment. It supports long term health, but also provides identity, confidence, and full participation in life. Thank you.